Hello and welcome to the third episode of Let's Talk Competition, organised by the European Commission's DG Competition. I'm Aoife White and I'm Politico Europe's Technology and Competition Editor. Today we're talking about the Digital Markets Act, a groundbreaking new EU law intended to tackle anti-competitive behaviour by big tech firms that it sees as key gatekeepers to the digital economy. Earlier this month, the Commission designated the companies and the services where it thinks stricter rules should apply. That set the clock ticking. There are now 6 months until March 6th for the companies to comply. With me today, I have Alberto Bacchiega, the Director for Digital Platforms at DG Competition, Inge, the Associate Professor of Competition Law at Tilburg University, and Vanessa Turner, Senior Advisor for Competition at the European Consumers Organisation BEUC. We'll talk today about the DMA, what the DMA aims to do, how tech firms will comply, and what the consequences could be of the new rules. But this is an open event, and we welcome your questions to the panel. You can send us your questions as of now using Slido. You can access Slido either by scanning the QR code that you can find on the DG Competition website, or that will be popping up on the screen regularly. You should be seeing it now. You can also go to slido.com and use the hashtag #Let'sTalkCompetition to participate. And please talk about us on social media as well, using the same hashtag #Let'sTalkCompetition. Let's first start with the aims of the Digital Markets Act. Alberto, is the DMA working well, and what does it mean for you?
Thank you, Aoife. It's a bit early to say if the DMA is working well. We just designated the companies and the services that will be subject to the DMA. Of course, we need to see how they will comply with the rules that are within. But what the goals of the DMA are very clear. They are ensuring more fairness and more contestability in European digital markets. These are not empty words. They will take a very concrete meaning, and they will translate into more open ecosystems, into more choice and control of consumers over the services they use, and more opportunity for businesses to actually develop new services and foster innovation. Just to give you some concrete examples of this, for consumers, we all have a smartphone. So on the smartphone, we will be more in control of the environment. We will be able to uninstall the apps we don't like. We will be able to install more easily the apps we like. We will be able to install them from an alternative, from a new app store, while today there is basically one choice. For an app developer, it will be easier to write the apps they want because we will improve the interoperability with the operating systems. They will have the choice of which app store to subscribe to reach the users. And also they will have the choice, for example, to choose which payment service they want to use to actually exchange with the consumers, something that today is not possible. For businesses, imagine a business that is selling goods on an online marketplace. They will have more control, or they will have control on the data they generate on this marketplace, something that is not the case today. And they will not have to face the competition from the gatekeeper against them using their own data. So these are very concrete benefits that we hope we will start seeing from spring next year. Of course, our goal is to open the ecosystem. We need businesses also to take up this challenge and to think how they can deliver new and better services to consumers this way.
So from what you're saying, there could be quite radical changes in how people use technology and what the digital landscape looks like.
We hope there will be very radical changes to the opportunities that are there for businesses and for consumers, yes.
We have 6 months between the designations and the compliance deadline in March. Alberto, can you tell us what's happening in the next, it's 5 and a bit months, just until March?
So I can tell you, we have several work streams in parallel. The chunkiest and probably the most important now is to ensure that there is effective compliance by next March. So that means having a very detailed discussions with the gatekeepers on the very concrete solutions they will bring and the very concrete changes they will have to make to their services. In this, of course, nobody knows the business and the technical feature of the services more than the gatekeepers themselves. So for us, one condition of making this a success is to have a very deep involvement also of the parties, consumer businesses that will benefit from the openness of the DMA. So what we want is to have solutions that are not only discussed with the commissions and approved by the commissions, but are actually tested and discussed with stakeholders more broadly in order to achieve a result that is usable by the public.
So this is quite an intense process for the Commission.
It is a very intense process, and it's not the only work stream that we have. On the same day when we designated the 6 gatekeepers, we also opened 5 market investigations. 4 of them it was about services that were meeting the thresholds in the DMA, but for which we doubt or we are not sure whether they should be designated or not. So we are investigating whether we should do it. And then we have a 5th market investigation, which is on the operating system for the iPad that does not meet the threshold. But again, we want to investigate if it is an important gateway between businesses and users, and we may investigate it. A 3rd work stream shows the dynamic nature of the DMA. We may have new services that will meet the thresholds early next year. We will look at different set of data regarding the thresholds. So we may have new candidates to be designated as gatekeepers and core platform services. And so we are already in discussions, what we would call pre-notification discussions with these companies. And finally, we are also preparing, should we defend the decision we have taken in court? Of course, we are preparing to do that with all our force.
What kind of things could companies challenge in court?
This is a very good question for the companies. If you ask me, I would say nothing. But of course, it is in the right to disagree with us. We have a feeling of where we don't agree because we have discussed extensively with the companies before they notified. We know where they notified. We know what is in the decision. But of course, it's up to the company to see if this warrants them going to the Court of Justice in Luxembourg to have our decisions appealed.
And what happens if there's a decision from the court before March? Say to pause, or we call it interim measures.
We will, of course, respect fully whatever decisions the court take. If our decision unchallenged, they will not suspend the effects of the DMA, but companies have the possibility to ask for interim measures and a suspension. So again, that's something for the court to decide, and the Commission will, of course, respect any judgment we will receive.
Inge, I'd like to bring you in. Is the Commission alone on this? What other regulators do we see playing a role?
Yeah, and the European Commission is, of course, the sole enforcer, so it's the only one that can take the actual decisions. But there's also a role for the national competition authorities, and the national competition authorities have actually already, during the whole legislative process, been asking to get involved as well. So, for instance, national competition enforcers can run own investigations for non-compliance, and this has several advantages. National competition authorities might have stronger links with smaller local businesses, and there may be less of a hurdle for those smaller businesses to go to their own competition authority rather than taking the step of going to the European Commission. And also, of course, this creates more resources for compliance. So, for instance, there is national competition authorities who have already quite some experience with data science, technical expertise, for instance, and one could imagine that this can also be of use in such compliance checks. Of course, this needs to be coordinated, but we have already seen that in the competition enforcement more regularly that there is quite a good mechanism for that within the European competition network. And beyond this, member states can also have their own rules in place under certain conditions. So when these rules go beyond the DMA's objectives of fairness and contestability, when they impose further obligations on gatekeepers, but also member states can impose obligations on non-gatekeepers. I think it's also desirable that at the national level there is scope for going beyond the DMA. We have already seen this in regular competition enforcement, that some cases are taken up that create new insight that can then also be used later on at the EU level. Of course, we don't want to see divergences in outcomes or conflicts, and also probably not duplication of efforts, but coordination, seems possible, and I think it's also desirable for the Commission to keep giving space to national competition authorities, because the DMA addresses a lot of concerns, but maybe not all, and those can also be taken up at first at the national level.
What countries do you see as having particular expertise or issues that they might want to investigate on?
So one example of a member state that already has relevant rules in place is, of course, Germany, where the Bundeskartellamt, in fact, now already has the competence to impose targeted ex-ante regulatory obligations on what they call undertakings of paramount significance for competition across markets. So it's a slightly different concept than gatekeepers. But there you see that indeed in some member states there is already the competence to do something similar than the DMA, and it is a question still how exactly this could interact with the DMA enforcement. But I think there is scope to coordinate this well and also give space to the national level.
Do you see the same kind of companies being targeted, or are there differences in what both Germany and, say, the Commission is looking at?
I think in terms of companies, there's quite some similarities. Of course, the concepts that are used in the DMA and, for instance, in the German legislation are slightly different in terms of the legal qualification. But in the end, we are targeting the same type of companies, of course, because these regimes all look at those companies that have the biggest impact on markets, and even though there are slight differences in the legal rules and the terminology, in terms of companies at least, and also in terms of obligations, there's quite some similarities and overlap.
Vanessa, to bring you in, consumers play an important part here in the benefits that you're expecting to get. How do you see the next 5 months playing out?
Well, I think I'll come back to Alberto's first work stream, because I think that is particularly important for consumers to get the obligations to work in 6 months' time when they're due to be complied with by gatekeepers. So, I mean, I hope that in those 6 months what we will see is genuine and detailed proposals from gatekeepers to the Commission, and then that be followed up with, as you indicated earlier, detailed discussions of those proposals with third parties, and by that I mean end users, consumers, business users, obviously, but also other experts like regulators in the sphere of consumer protection or data protection, because I think they can also bring some expertise into evaluating whether compliance with the obligations is taking place. I think it would be also good to see some kind of market testing along the lines of, take an example from antitrust, along the lines of testing of commitments. That kind of thing might be a useful way to kind of get a view on whether the obligations are going to be implemented in the way that they should be. What I wouldn't like to see, on the other hand, would be a kind of hands-off approach by the Commission, so kind of leaving implementation to the gatekeepers and not getting kind of involved in the details, sort of more along the lines of remedies after a prohibition decision. But it sounds like from what Alberto said that's not going to happen, because I think that would be good. And I think it's particularly important because in order to achieve one of the goals of the DMA, so ex ante regulation, and which is kind of perhaps one of the value adds compared to competition law, to antitrust law, I think it really will require a detailed evaluation of the gatekeeper proposals, and then the Commission giving guidance in terms of compliance, non-compliance, so that we can get to a position in March that we have a clear view on what would be compliance with the DMA obligations. Because I fear that if in 6 months we have to do a lot of non-compliance enforcement, then this stage will not have been a huge success.
I want to drill down a bit more into compliance and practice, about how it works. Alberto, we know what the aim is, but how does it come about? How do you get companies to comply? I mean, if companies come up with several options, how do you choose which is the best one?
So the compliance workstream, of course, has started literally but before even the designation decision. We had discussion on compliance, and now we are making this discussion more systemic. So basically what we started with is a mapping. Now we know we have 6 companies that have been designated. We have 22 core platform services that have been designated so far. and we have 20 some provisions, depending a little bit how you count them. So if you think that makes several hundred, in theory, provisions to implement. So what we are doing is the mapping of what is relevant for what service, for what company, and importantly, what then for what is relevant, what is the gap between what is there and where we want to get. And so we need to agree on the gap with the gatekeepers, and then we also need to agree on the way to fill this gap. And in that, the burden of proof is on the gatekeepers. Is for them to propose to us and to stakeholders the way they will comply. We don't have the knowledge of their business, and we don't have the capacity technically to write code for them and so on. But they have an obligation of result. So they have to deliver a solution that works. So I'm not sure they will come with a menu of solutions and say, pick one you like. I see more an iterative process where we discuss first the broad lines, the concept of how they will comply, and then we will go down into the details of actually how that will be rolled out. And on that, we would like indeed to have the views and the opinion of the stakeholders, because they are those that will pick up these opportunities. If there is a way, to comply, to ensure interoperability goes through coding, APIs. We need the businesses that have ideas and they say, so far I haven't been able to develop this idea because I find a wall in front of me, to tell us if the solution is actually breaking this wall or if it's just a facade and behind there is another wall. Mm. So that's what we are going to do in the coming months. So agreeing on the work plan, which is basically what has been done now, seeing what the gap is, how to fill the gap, consult stakeholders.
How do you know that what these companies telling you is truthful? I mean, some of these companies are criticized for being black boxes. What kind of expertise do you have to check what they're saying, or how do you test it with others?
We have some expertise in-house, also from the technical side on data science, which is a very broad term, but let's use it here. We also have a web of connections that, also we have a joint research center of the Commission that can help us on the technical side. We can contract out part of this work, and then, but then, crucially, we need indeed, and I come back to that, we need the stakeholders to tell us if it is effective or not. Again, the DMA is not about agreeing one solution that is frozen in time, and whether we get it right, if we get it wrong, tough luck. It's also a process, and if something doesn't work, it means it will need to be changed. And so gatekeepers, I don't think they have an interest in proposing something that will not work, because they will have to do their job twice. They will have to change now and then change again to make it work. On the first part of your question, how do we know that that we are told all the truth and only the truth, etc.? It's part of the usual relationship between an enforcer and or a regulator, as we are now, and companies. Of course, they legitimately care for creating value for their shareholders. So we are not, we are not under the illusion that we will be told everything. It's our job to understand what is relevant and to distill what is relevant. And what we've always done to do that is not to close ourselves in a room with the companies we deal with, but actually to test the solution on the market.
Vanessa, is asymmetry of information a problem, that some companies know everything about their own business and the companies that might criticize them don't, or consumers indeed don't?
Yes, I do think it is potentially a very significant problem. By definition, the gatekeepers know everything about their business. Well, one would assume in any event. And the Commission and third parties, other stakeholders don't. I think that's the nature of the situation, as Alberto has already said. But I think you've already also hinted at one of the ways to combat that, and that would be to use third parties, other stakeholders, to bring their knowledge to the issues. And again, they're business users, clearly, end users, civil society, but also other regulators who can have expertise and who may be able to bring information to the table that could at least eliminate to some degree the asymmetry that will exist and that you indicated already.
Are you getting the kind of information you need? I mean, what kind of information, what level of information do you need?
Well, I think that will actually be the key. In order for third parties or other stakeholders to bring any meaningful input to this debate, they are going to need sufficiently detailed information. Otherwise, it's going to be superficial, and what we're looking at is the actual weeds of the implementation here. And I mean, I think the importance of other stakeholders getting detailed information in order to give meaningful input is actually recognised in the draft compliance report template, which specifically says this. But I think that's not only applicable then, but also perhaps even more so, in fact, at the current stage. So I'm hoping there are kind of creative ways that could be done to try and get to the level of information that we need through, I don't know, some ad hoc production of information or perhaps a draft section of a compliance report, which I guess will have to be prepared as the gatekeepers are going along, or perhaps bilateral discussions between gatekeepers and other stakeholders. But maybe to drill down a bit to give an example of the kind of a level of information issue. If I think of, say, Article 5.2 of the DMA, so the article that says that gatekeepers can't combine data from various different services or cross-use or use in various different ways data that they get, except with the consent of consumers. I think checking that is going to require sort of two dimensions of detail. First of all, what I would call like the back office processes. It will be important for the Commission to get sufficiently detailed information on where data is stored, how it's processed, how it's being used, to kind of work out whether that side of the equation is going to be compliant in terms of what the gatekeeper does. But then we also need to look at the front end of this particular obligation, and actually others as well, to see what kind of user interface the gatekeeper is proposing. So I think it will be, in terms of the detail that will be necessary, it will be important for the gatekeepers to show, essentially on a click-by-click basis, what the consumers are going to be presented with in order to make a genuine decision, do I consent or don't I consent? So I think it'll be important to show the wording that is going to be presented to consumers. It'll be important to have screenshots of every step that the consumer goes through, because details in user interface really matter. And we know that you can steer consumers in one direction rather than another, and presumably in the direction of the gatekeeper rather than what the consumer actually wants to do in terms of data sharing or not, through just slight tweaks of the detail. I mean, just think about, say, cookies. Even as a very well-informed consumer, it is sometimes very hard not to say yes to cookies. So that kind of level of detail, I think, will be absolutely key in making sure that the obligations are implemented properly. And perhaps one further thought on that, I imagine that the gatekeepers, or I believe they are already testing user interfaces to a certain degree, so I think it will be important in terms of level of detail also to see the results of that testing, to see what design tweaks, what impact design tweaks have on the interaction that consumers have with the services. So I'm hoping that kind of information will be made available. If it's not, then I'm also wondering whether it would be a good idea to use the Commission's powers to make sure you can get it. And by that, I'm thinking about Article 21, 22, 23 of the DMA. So sending requests for information, interviews, or possibly even on-site inspections. But so to come back to your question, I think the level of detail is going to be key to this. And hopefully I've illustrated the kind of...
Alberto, it sounds like Vanessa's asking you a question, which is how are consumers going to be checking that this is actually consumer friendly?
But Vanessa has a very good point in this, and is actually our ambition and our idea is to do very closely what Vanessa was just illustrating, and to use all the powers that we have at our disposal on request for information. It's we have already started this process. We are already asking. The DMA allows for an escalation if we're not happy with the replies we receive. We are certainly ready to use the other tools, the more intrusive tools, if we cannot get the information in this way. But the idea is indeed to test the solution with the consumers, citizens, businesses that can benefit from the solution. So for another example, we have interoperability provisions in the DMA, which means to make the operating system of the gatekeeper more open to third parties. This typically is done through protocols, the famous APIs. Of course, the testing can only be through releasing or pre-releasing these APIs so that companies can try and see if it works. If it doesn't work, they need to go back and they need to change until it works. So there is another provision that says gatekeepers cannot do self-preferencing, so they cannot promote their own services in competition with other services just by pushing them up in the ranking in a search page, for example. Then they will have to present concrete screenshot examples of how it will work. And on the basis of that, we will have a discussion with stakeholders. Does it work? Is it the right thing? Does it look good at first sight, but there is some dark pattern in there that actually determines what the clicker behavior will be that we are not seeing at first sight? That we will certainly do. This is a process that we need to do indeed in the next 5 months. And Vanessa also mentioned the compliance report, which is a very, very important tool because the gatekeepers will have to write in the report exactly what they've done, what they wanted to do, but then they chose not to do, what solution have they done, why they reached a specific conclusion, what were the alternatives, and so they will have to explain in a detailed way also the process to which they arrived at the solution they propose.
Inge, to ask you a different question. We're aware that there's an awful lot of digital regulation right now. I mean, everything from the General Data Protection Regulation, which gives us the cookies. So we have consent. What new dynamics are we seeing here when companies are thinking about compliance? I mean, are we seeing other regulations feed into the DMA? And what other regulations are most relevant here?
Yeah, so indeed there's quite some obligations in the DMA that stem from competition cases. So the self-preferencing obligation, for instance, is stemming from the Google search, the Google shopping case. There is a restriction in the DMA on the use of data from business users, which comes from the Amazon case. So some of these obligations now have a wider scope, of course, than the competition cases that they stem from. But the objectives of the DMA, fairness and contestability, already point at the fact that the DMA indeed has a wider scope and also includes concerns and problems that are not only competition issues. And here you can already see, like Vanessa mentioned, data protection, and you mentioned the GDPR. Indeed, there are some obligations in the DMA as well that relate to GDPR rules. For instance, data portability, so the ability of you as an individual, but also of a business user to transfer your data elsewhere. And also the data combination that Vanessa mentioned. So this is also something that the GDPR already regulates to some extent. However, the requirements of the DMA are in a sense more specific, more demanding. So for instance, taking the example of data portability, the GDPR is of course limited to personal data. That is not the case for the DMA. And also in the GDPR context, there has been a whole discussion on what the scope of the data is that can be ported as an individual. And the DMA is much clearer on that. It does not only include data that you actively provide as a consumer, but also data that is generated by your use of a service, so also observed data. And beyond this, also the DMA says that data portability has to happen free of charge and in a continuous and real-time manner, which are really specific requirements that will also make data portability more effective. And I think the fact that the DMA is more specific, for instance, in this example of data portability, makes a lot of sense because the GDPR is a horizontal regime, so it applies to all data controllers, whereas of course the purpose of the DMA is to impose stricter obligations on those companies that we know have a stronger impact. So I think it's also important to realize that it would not be desirable for the DMA, for instance, to substitute these GDPR rules, but really to impose stricter obligations going beyond this general baseline that the GDPR already sets. And then the fact that the DMA has this broader scope, I think you also see that in the enforcement system, because there will be this, or there is already this high-level group for the Digital Markets Act that also includes the data protection authorities, but also the consumer and media regulators that have an advisory role, and that will also need to be important to promote the consistency across all these different regulatory instruments. So in this sense, we can indeed see these new dynamics. It's clearly recognized that there is overlap, and hopefully this is also a first step in getting towards more strong collaboration among all these different regulators, which I think that is really something that we need in this space.
I mean, the DMA has a lot of hopes attached to it. There are risks that it could fail or that it could have unintended consequences. Vanessa, what would be a good outcome for consumers from the DMA?
Right. Let me start with just mentioning a survey that BEUC published recently on consumers' views on the online environment, because there's some results that came out of that survey which I think are very relevant to that question. So in that survey, it turned out that less than 50% of consumers feel in control of the content that they're shown online and the decisions that they make online. So I think that's an important statistic to bear in mind. Also, people find tracking and monitoring online to be unfair. And the research also found that 76% of people want to have a greater choice about how much data is collected on them by smart devices, and only 7% don't want to have that choice. So I think bearing in mind the DMA's objective of fairness that Alberto mentioned, which also applies to end users, not just business users, a good outcome would be to empower consumers to make genuine choices and be in control of their decision making. But I think there's another angle to that, is on the contestability side, and that would be also, actually picking up on what Alberto said earlier, would be that and the other side of the good outcome would be to actually have those choices where they have not necessarily been genuine choices to date in terms of services. So not only data combination, but things like data portability that Inge mentioned, and also choice of apps, as Alberto mentioned early on. That is going to be very important, that consumers actually get a genuine choice on that. And there are lots of ways in the DMA to promote this, as Alberto has also already mentioned. Another way will be through, in certain circumstances anyway, under one of the articles of the DMA, the Article 6.3, the use of choice screens, which we've also done some research on, which we will publish shortly. But so I think in terms of the outcome, I don't think it's going to be a big bang necessarily. There will be some things where we will see yes or no, are the gatekeepers complying in terms of the user interface, for example. But some things might take a bit more time to happen as consumers react to the new options that the DMA hopefully gives them.
If we end up saying one day that the DMA has failed, what kind of areas do you fear it might have failed on?
I think there'll be three areas that spring to mind. The first one would be that if gatekeepers start to play circumvention games with the DMA, and if that circumvention goes uncorrected or unsanctioned, then I think, or let's say unsanctioned in any meaningful way, then I think there's a risk that the credibility of the DMA might be at risk of failing, and the success of the DMA would also then be put at risk. So that's one of the key risks that I would see, but hopefully the Commission will not allow that to happen. I think a second thing, and this is actually picking up on two things that Inge mentioned, I think it would be unfortunate if the DMA were to inadvertently get in the way of antitrust enforcement outside the scope of the DMA, whether it's antitrust enforcement at the member state level or even at the Commission level, because there's a lot that still needs doing outside of the DMA, and which can also, as you mentioned, feed back into the DMA. And then I think the third area of risk of failure would also be what, just to pick up on what Inge said, and that would be if we end up in some kind of regulatory mess because of the inclusion of certain other types of regulation within, or legal concepts within the DMA, so as you mentioned, data protection, consumer protection, it will be important that those concepts are interpreted consistently. So I think to avoid all of those failing outcomes, I think it's going to be very important to have a well thought out enforcement strategy as well as a timely enforcement strategy. But I'm hopeful after seeing what the Commission did in terms of the designation decisions with a kind of sensible focus that we're going to avoid those failings.
Alberto, the DMA is very prescriptive and based on some of the behaviour we've seen in previous years. We're aware that new things are cropping up, and one of them in the last year has been generative AI. How would you deal with generative AI were it to become so successful and so widely taken up that it could be a platform service?
There are all signs that it is already very successful, and generative AI is the latest iteration of artificial intelligence that has been around for quite some time and that is already embedded in many platform services that we are about to regulate. And the same is happening for generative AI. For example, one example of this is that the integration of a chatbot reply into the search engine of Microsoft Bing, which actually is something we are investigating right now as part of the investigation of whether to designate or not Bing. So there are different levels. So you can see generative AI as a new tool, as a new enabler to do better things, sometimes perhaps dangerous things, but certainly also better things. And that is part of the normal analysis that we do into the in looking into the core platform services. It could also be that generative AI changes a little bit the model and changes the way the core platform services look like in somehow. And there we have the possibility to open a market investigation to investigate actually, for example, a service that does not meet the threshold but is boosted by generative AI. We could decide to designate it anyway as a core platform service or as an emerging service. And also in the DMA, there is the possibility, if generative AI were to create a new platform on its own, actually to do an investigation also to establish that, and then to propose a targeted modification of the DMA in order to include these new services in the list of services that is now in the regulation.
Do you think it's very well covered that AI is not necessarily outside the scope of the DMA?
The DMA is looking at one part of what platforms do, which is fairness, contestability, let's say more the economic side, the behavior, the interaction with users and with businesses. Now, AI is posing major challenges to our societies, and it's not only the DMA can give the answer for that. As we all know, there is a regulation of the Commission that is proposed by the Commission now being discussed by the co-legislator to regulate artificial intelligence. And that is, of course, there need to be a concerted effort from all the angles to understand and regulate this phenomenon. I think the DMA has all the tools it needs to cover the part that pertains to the DMA, which is, let's say, the more economic interaction part.
One of the concerns we've had in recent years is the effect of technology on democracy and on society. How far can the DMA act against that?
Yeah, so in this sense, the DMA is not alone. Of course, there's other regulations beyond the DMA as well. One of them that goes in the direction of also protecting societal values is, of course, the DSA, so the Digital Services Act, which regulates content moderation, but also requires platforms to monitor systemic risks. And of course, beyond that, there is also other acts, AI Act, the Data Act. So in this sense, we see different instruments, and the DMA is one piece of that emerging regulatory framework, which also offers opportunities for a more comprehensive approach, separate instruments targeting separate objectives. And this also means that there is a need to ensure coherence, so coherence not only in the substance of the rules, but also in the enforcement system. And here we have seen that sometimes platforms use the fact that approaches are isolated in a strategic manner. So for instance, by claiming that privacy is a reason for them not to be able to open up their systems to the benefit of competition. And here I think it's also important, as already said before, for regulators to team up and also to clarify that there will be ways to comply with different regulations in parallel, and that these regulations are not necessarily clashing with each other. Here one blind spot that I think we still have is mergers. The DMA, of course, introduces this obligation for gatekeepers to inform the European Commission of acquisitions, but the DMA does not change the substantive assessment. And what we have seen in the past years is that some of these mergers could also potentially have impact beyond the economic efficiency concerns that are tested in merger review, so risks for fundamental rights, data protection. And of course, I'm not saying that the European Commission or competition authorities should include this in their merger assessment, but I think there is a need for regulators to collaborate more proactively. What we often see is that indeed then the Commission says data protection is outside of our assessment. This is for data protection authorities to do. And indeed, data protection authorities have already said that they would be willing to support that assessment, but in practice, we don't see those collaborated approaches yet. So here I feel we're really still behind reality. And this is, I think, also important because one of the ways in which platforms get a stronger position is through acquisitions. So they enter new areas, education, health, and that also has risks for society, and that should become more transparent. So I think in that way, for regulators to start collaborating and teaming up in assessments would be really needed. And beyond that, the DSA, I think, is a valuable complement to the DMA, especially to create more transparency. So this obligation for platforms to monitor systemic risks and to report on that, I think this can be a first step, and also understanding better what effects platforms have on society and democracy.
Thank you. Now, over to you. Remember, if you're watching at home or in your office, if you'd like to ask a question, just scan the QR code that pops up on the screen use the hashtag Let's Talk Competition on the Slido website. Type your question and press Ask. Now we can take our first question from Slido already. Maybe I can start with this one with Alberto. Is there a risk that the DMA will hinder innovation?
Some parts say that that is the risk. I actually think it's the other way around. The DMA will foster innovation. So the way we see it, we have ecosystems that have innovated enormously, that have improved our lives and changed our lives enormously. Let's think of the smartphone. But they have grown into what we call gatekeepers. So they hold the reins of what is happening on that environment. And so what has happened is quite normal. Every possible innovation needs to be approved, needs to be vetted. And so what goes through, there is still innovation, but is innovation that actually needs to go on the track that is decided by the gatekeeper. And if there is innovation that is actually going differently in another track, simply it will find no way to reach consumers and users. So what the DMA wants to do is actually to open this ecosystem and to let more businesses experiment, and to let more people who have brilliant ideas the possibility to actually bring these ideas to the public. Now, the gatekeepers may be happy because they bring more traffic. They may be unhappy because it takes away business from them, or in the longer term, it can endanger really the position, the hold they have on the ecosystem. And that is why by opening, we can only produce more innovation. And then there is a second aspect. The gatekeepers that now hold this position, they work very hard, but they are also in a comfortable situation because they are not challenged so easily. They can actually decide who is challenging, or they can block the challenges that they find dangerous. If one day these challengers will have more possibility to bring their solutions to the users, the gatekeepers themselves will think very hard, how they can also propose new things, how can they propose better services to consumers. So we will have a double way in which competition or contestability, as we call it, will bring benefits to consumers, which is basically the goal of this legislation.
Vanessa, do you see a risk to innovation from the DMA?
No, actually, I think I would see more of a risk to innovation without the DMA for all the very good reasons that Alberto just outlined. I don't think I can add anything to that because I think that was it's pretty much how I see it as well. The DMA should actually spur more innovation, not only by business users who can, as a result of the DMA, reach end users, consumers, but also that will spur more innovation from the gatekeepers themselves. I think the answer is the opposite.
Another question here on compliance. Article 28 requires a compliance function. What are the attributes of a properly constituted function and how do you expect to be engaging with them? That sounds like it's a question for Alberto, but please, if either Vanessa or Inge want to jump in, you can. Alberto, we can start briefly with you. If you
Okay, so we all say that gatekeepers have to comply by next March. There are two exceptions. One is the information about acquisition Inge was talking about that kicked in on the day of the designation, and the other is the compliance function that also is already in place. So we have been engaging with the gatekeepers, and actually what we are doing now, we are checking their proposal specifically of what the compliance function should be. So what is the compliance function? Should be is within the company, but should have the independence to actually check that the company is complying with the DMA through the position of a compliance officer that should be independent enough, high-ranked enough, with all the safeguards, personal and functional, that allow the person to take a position that is not reporting to the legal office that is negotiating with us what the solution is, but should be independent with direct access to the decision-making body of the company, and basically checking that what the provisions of the DMA are complied with. Basically, it's the person within the company that should put all the alarm bells on and say, guys, we are at risk of non-compliance. We are at risk of getting a non-compliance investigation from the Commission. Something needs to change here. It will be also our port of call to signal dangers of non-compliance. It should also be open to third parties and stakeholders to do exactly the same. And incidentally, it's also the person that will sign off the compliance report that the gatekeepers will have to issue annually.
Yeah, we have a question here about the compliance report as well, as when do we expect the Commission to publish a final version of the compliance report template, and how much of the report do you expect to be shared? I think you're going to tell me confidentiality reasons make that difficult, but...
Yeah, so the final version compliance report is imminent. Now I don't remember exactly the timing, but we had a consultation period that closed just after the summer, I think. We got very good suggestions. We're integrating the suggestions. The general shape of our guidance will remain similar, improved, and so that and on the compliance report itself, of course, there will be a confidential version and a non-confidential version. We place a huge importance on the non-confidential version of the report. So our guidance, and it is actually in the guidance, to say that it needs to be a self-standing document that is intelligible from third parties. It's not just half a sentence and then the other half blacked out, nobody understands what it is, but it needs to be a document that everyone can read and understand what the gatekeepers have done and why they chose what to do.
Just Inge and Vanessa, on the compliance reports, is speed important, that these things come out soon and not in 2 years' time?
I think it is important. Speed is important, but equally detail, as Alberto said. I mean, if we have large chunks of things blacked out, as one sometimes sees in competition cases, it's going to be very difficult for third parties to work out what is going on. Clearly, there are business secrets, but there are ways of providing enough information to actually make it a meaningful compliance report, as Alberto said.
Inge, I have a question for you. Is the DMA an EU tool, or is it something that has a wider reach? Do you think it's likely to touch the rest of the world as well?
Yeah, I think the DMA could definitely have an impact globally and beyond the EU, and I think it's definitely also desirable to coordinate and to prevent conflicts as much as possible. But I would also say that it's also important to acknowledge that other jurisdictions might have other priorities or other beliefs. So we see already that other jurisdictions pick up things that are not regulated as much in the EU. For instance, one example that now comes to mind is Australia, where the legislator has adopted this news media bargaining code to balance the relationship between platforms and news publishers, which does not have an immediate equivalent in the EU. So I think it's also useful for other jurisdictions to go beyond, because regulating the digital sector is not like an exact science. You don't always know what is right or wrong or what is the best priority to be set. So I think here is also important to do learning by doing, and allowing for some level of divergence can be useful as well. And of course you want to prevent clashes, but some experimentation might be helpful, and if other jurisdictions take different concerns up or have different priorities, there might be something for the EU to learn too.
Alberto, we have another question for you. Will the Commission require both sideloading and alternative app stores, or does the Commission see them as alternative?
They are both mentioned in the DMA as possibility. The goal is the same, so is to allow a more open and freer possibility to install apps on what are now closed ecosystems. There are many nuances in both. So we need to see exactly how the implementation will go, but the point is to achieve the possibility for app developers to reach end users without having to go through the one and only gate with all the restrictions that come with that.
We also had another question for you, which was about gatekeepers' cloud services, which have not been qualified by the Commission. Will the Commission also start a market investigation in this area?
This is something probably that is not for me. I cannot comment on now. Of course, when the Commission starts an investigation, communicates publicly about it when it is the moment to communicate. What I can say on cloud service is that the fact that they have not been designated, and also they have not been notified by cloud services provider, because these cloud services providers have done their homework, and they looked whether they were meeting the thresholds, and they concluded that they were not meeting the thresholds. Now it's indeed a possibility to start a market investigation to designate them from a qualitative point of view. It's certainly something a possibility we consider seriously, but of course is not it's not something I can announce or not announce in this forum.
Another question we have is why Twitter or X is not designated as the platform or gatekeeper.
Again, the answer is the same. They basically they didn't meet the quantitative thresholds, and that again was the assessment of the group to which Twitter X belongs. And with the qualitative threshold, the situation can change also from one year to the other. So that's we also need to see how the situation will evolve in this sense. Again, I'm not at freedom to tell all the details of why or what specific figures were not met, because these involve confidential information.
You did say earlier that this is something you're looking at for early next year, so I would advise everyone to keep an eye on what the Commission gets up to.
Not any company in particular, but certainly, what will happen next year is that we look at 3 years back. So 2020 will be out and 2023 will be in. And anything that changes because of this change of year basically will determine a new new wave of notifications.
There's a question for Vanessa. What are, in your view, the most relevant obligations for consumers?
Oh, that's a very interesting question. I think there are several. I would say particularly those obligations that are directly consumer facing. Some of them are more business to business facing. They're probably going to be of less direct, although nevertheless indirect interest to consumers. But those that are of most interest will be the ones where consumers should have an increased choice. We mentioned apps before, data portability was mentioned before, data combination I mentioned. Those will probably be some of the key ones, but also the other way the information is presented to consumers. So self-preferencing could be an interesting area for consumers as well, in terms of getting genuine choice rather than a slanted choice. So I think I would say there are quite a range of them that link directly to consumer choice. And across the board, as I indicated earlier, the user interface will be of interest to us across multiple obligations.
We have a question about, do you think DMA's fairness and contestability goals can be equated to competition between platforms and competition in the platform respectively? Who would like to take that up?
I could give it a try.
Please.
Yeah, so I think indeed fairness and contestability are quite broad concepts. They are not really very specifically defined, but indeed it covers both the relationship of the platform with businesses, so within the platform, and with consumers in the platform. But indeed also the DMA's obligations apply across platforms as well, so they also apply across the gatekeepers actually. So in that sense you see both of the aspects included in that. Hopefully the DMA, once implemented, will make markets more contestable, both creating choices as alternatives for the platforms we already have, but indeed also giving businesses who now rely on platforms to reach consumers more opportunity to do so.
We have a question again for Alberto. How does the Commission plan to consult third parties in the next few months? Will it be sharing non-confidential versions of the compliance reports? I think you have said you would, but I think the question is a little bit more on the timing. Is this something that I think they want to squeeze a promise from you?
No, but on the compliance report there will be a version that we will, a public version, but that will be next March. So the companies have an obligation to submit the report basically by compliance. So that will be a kind of repository of what has been done in the 6 months. Now, what needs to happen before is the concrete solution for the specific obligation for the specific services, and there the consultation with third parties can take a number of forms. There are some things that need to be rolled out, for example. So they should be rolled out in a beta version or in a version for interested parties to be able to try and to comment on. Other provisions are contractual, so that we will need to see the draft of this contract. Other provisions are negative, so that it's something you cannot do that. So to the extent that the gatekeepers don't do it, it's difficult to prove the opposite. So so we will tailor the consultation of the stakeholders to the best way we can reach them for the specific provisions. And then the compliance report will actually have all of them but when compliance is already taking place.
Thank you very much for joining us, Alberto, Inge, and Vanessa, and thank you all for watching. Let's Talk Competition will be back next month to discuss the Foreign Subsidies Regulation. So please keep an eye on DG Competition's website and follow EU Competition on X and LinkedIn for more details. You can share this episode or watch it again if you go to the DG Competition YouTube channel. Thank you again.